Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the evolution of work in a gig economy. I'm Allison DeFlorio, and I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Exude Human Capital. And we are so honored to have with us one of our partners, the Allére Group, a woman-owned staffing solutions organization that does quite a bit of work in this space, and will allow them to share a little bit more about their work. But I want to, before we introduce our panel today of fantastic contributors to this conversation, I wanted to share a little bit about how we landed on this topic. We've been talking with the Allére Group and with our clients and the community for over the past year about what businesses are facing as it relates to how to meet business demands and to honor this rise, this surge in the gig economy, and to do it while being compliant. You fast forward, we all know that on March 11th of this year, there were new regulations around the testing for independent contractor that went into place. And now we have a different situation where employers want to be sure that they are meeting business demands, but doing so in a compliant manner. So today's conversation is going to address some of the context for the gig economy, as well as some of the potential considerations for employers, both for profit and nonprofit, because we know that we have both segments of the population represented on this call, on how you can make sure that you're navigating these new regulations in a compliant manner. I do want to do a little bit of a disclaimer here. The three presenters today, myself included, we're not attorneys, and the focus of this presentation is not around the legalities, although we will be focusing on compliance. So I just want to make sure that that you understand that we're coming to this from the the people perspective and the business perspective as far as how do you remain compliant and keep a gig economy engaged to help you drive your business demands. So, a couple of housekeeping tips before we introduce the panel. This is being recorded, and we will be sending out a link after the session. So, please feel free to share that link with someone you feel wasn't able to attend and might find this of value. Also, your questions are really important to us. We do have content we want to share with you today, but we do want to address as many questions as you have to the extent that we can. If we can't, I already got the commitment from my co-presenters today that you can feel free to reach out to any one of us after this session, and we'd be happy to talk offline with you. So, with further ado, you let me introduce our panel. I'm going to kick it off just to give a little bit more context for those of you who may not be familiar with Exude Human Capital. We are a Philadelphia-based human resources consulting firm. We've been around for about 18 years, and we specialize in the areas of human resources, diversity, equity, inclusion, and leadership development. For the purposes of today, I'd like to focus on some of the experiences and work that we have been doing in this space of employee classification and helping organizations meet their business demands through flexible work arrangements. And I'm super honored to turn it over to one of my fellow Exudians, Romaine Jones-Wise. Ro?
Good morning, everyone. I am very excited to be here to be part of today's conversation and to connect with you all. My name is Romaine Jones-Wise, pronoun she, her, hers. I'm a senior consultant with Exude Human Capital and have extensive experience working with clients to navigate this space of independent contractor versus employee, and just utilizing some best practices in how to engage independent contractors within a project team and workforce. So looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you. And Mary, again, we're so honored to have Allére Group as our partner here. And if you could share a little bit about yourself and about Allére Group.
That sounds wonderful. Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Allison and Ro, for welcoming the Allére group on this webinar today. So my name is Mary Martin. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer of the Allére group. We are a workforce solutions company based in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, and we are a woman-owned enterprise. We've been operating for 20 years, and my background has really been within contingent labor and contractors management around workers that are non-employees that are doing project-based work or staffing support for enterprise companies. So I have worked for large staffing firms that have done this in the past, and at Allére, we're really focused on encouraging our customers to look at the legalities that surround these things, the risk that surround engaging with 1099s, but more importantly, showing them and guiding them to this North Star now that there are some new laws that have come through this year. So really excited to jump in and share with you what we have seen as far as growth within this talent community and how this population is growing, and some areas that you and your staff can look at to go ahead and make sure that you are compliant and you are avoiding some of that risk.
Great. Thank you. So our journey today is going to start off with giving some context about this gig economy and looking at some stats, which are pretty astounding as far as where it is and what the trajectory is being forecasted to be. We'll talk about the current legislation, talk a little bit about the history behind it, but then we're really going to get into the meat of what are the risks, and then what are the considerations of some of the potential staffing models to mitigate the misclassification situation. And then Ro's going to share some of the work that she's been doing with regards to strategies for managing a blended workforce there. And we'll end with some key takeaways. Again, please feel free to share your questions as they come up, and we'll do our best to answer them. So without further ado, let's talk about the gig economy. So you've heard it, you've read it, you see it in the news. I think the gig economy, started quite a while ago, but we really saw a surge after the pandemic. And when you look at some of these stats, this is pretty astounding. So almost 50% of workers are independent contractors in this space. We've got 89% of companies that intend to increase their use of freelancers or independent contractors over the next 5 years. And think about this number. We're talking 50% now, 86.5 million people by 2025, and over 100 million by 2028 are expected to be classified in this freelancer independent contractor space, to the tune globally of about $500 billion added to the economy. So these are pretty significant stats. And I'll date myself for a moment because I remember back in the early 2000s hearing a futurist in the business space talk about 2030, and there would be 50% of the workforce would be independent contractors by 2030. And this was probably around 2002, 4. And I'm thinking to myself, really? Wow, a lot's going to have to change. And look, that's already happened. So I think what's also really interesting is if you dig into the statistics around who are these gig workers, 90% of them are under the age of 45. Close to 50% are in that classified millennial space that are current leaders of organizations, potential leaders of organizations. So it's interesting how you've seen that big shift. We have close to 40% of Gen Z, new workers. We know that that's a really interesting demographic entering the workforce, expecting flexibility, not wanting necessarily to come into the workspace or to be confined or controlled by an employer. So having this option to do things independently is of quite interest to them. And you see the average age there. So I think we take all of this in consideration. Think of the demographics of your organization today and think about where it may be in 5 years. And let's think now about what is happening with legislation around this. So that's moving. We can't control that. But we do know that effective March 11th, the new independent contractor rule took place. Now, there had been a ruling under the last administration in 2021 that around independent contractor, but that was rescinded and replaced with this new ruling. What has changed in between the 2021 and the 2024 is that the 2021 focused primarily and gave heavy weight to two of these six factors. The two that are bolded, the opportunity for profit or loss depending on managerial skill. So the degree to which someone could control how much they were making or not making based on their control over their fees or their salaries or those kinds of things. And then the nature and degree of control. So under the 2021 ruling, this was really more in favor of an employer, and talked about the degree of control wasn't as scrutinized or it didn't carry the same weight as it considers today. These six factors, just for historical context, have been around in one shape or form for over 70 years. So I think that's kind of interesting. They've not been applied consistently over the 70 years. So the effort around this independent contractor rule was to give some degree of consistency around how employers are going to evaluate jobs or projects to determine, or individuals to determine whether or not they really classify as an independent contractor. I will tell you, it is complicated because if you read the 333 page ruling on this, which I know you're all going to do, you'll notice that it also adds in there, in addition to these six factors, there may be other extenuating circumstances that may impact whether or not someone is classified as an independent contractor. We have included a link here, so when you see the recording, that will come out, but we'll also put that in the notes, to some of the more specifics and rules around the definitions of each of these characteristics. But this is what is in place today for employers to determine whether or not someone is an independent contractor. This link also gives you full definitions about what each of these mean, but it's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, the investments by the worker or the potential employer, they're going to look at how much is the employer contributing. Are they contributing equipment, work products, tools, resources, systems that the employee has to use versus investments by the worker? Are they using their own laptop, their own equipment, those kinds of things? The degree of permanence of the work relationship. Is it a project with a set amount of time, with a set scope of work, or is it ongoing, indefinite? Then you may be looking at a questionable relationship there as far as employee to employer. And then the extent to which the work is performed as part of the potential employer's business. The example that they'll say is, if it's a tomato farm and the person is picking tomatoes, then it's likely that that person is an employee because that is integral to the nature of that work. It's a very simplistic example, but just to kind of showcase how they do this. And then skill and initiative, how much skill is required to do the work, and does it require certain educational or expertise that may not be expected of others in that role. So this six-factor test is what you would use to determine whether a worker qualifies as an independent contractor. Now, if indeed you use the test or you don't use the test, what they're saying you have to be mindful of is whether it's intentional or unintentional that employees are misclassified as contractors when they should be employees. There are consequences, expensive consequences, legal consequences, lawsuits, back pay, liability for back pay, liability for benefits or payments for misclassified workers. When I think back to the origination of these laws, remember that they were put in place to protect low wage earners from being taken advantage of and not being paid minimum wage or being eligible for benefits. Fast forward to what we've just described as this new gig economy, it's become, as we look at this, we have to consider the factors a little bit differently and more consistently. What we are suggesting is that employers really need to reevaluate contractual agreements, look at modifying work arrangements. There are ways to do this to be compliant. And there are things that Mary will share with you that she has seen her group work with to do so. And reviewing work descriptions, is the job in question, is it a regular job that an employee should have, and weigh those 6 factors equally. Remember, those 6 factors are weighted equally in this new regulation. So that said, I'm going to turn it over to Mary to talk through a little bit more about the risks, benefits, and considerations.
Thank you so much, Allison. Yeah, so we have seen a lot of lawsuits over the last several years in the news. Some large companies that we're all aware of that are facing different civil charges, case action lawsuits, et cetera, and even not able to operate in certain states because they're not classifying their employees correctly. So as we look at some of those consequences, one of the areas that you really want to be focused on is who is actually taking care of some of those tasks, getting those individuals through the door and that onboarding process. What does that look like? So we'll dive into that a little bit more. But the main areas of risks are within the joint employment claims, the co-employment claims, lack of proper business liability insurance. So if some of the 1099s or ICs that your company is engaged with that doesn't have proper insurance, those might be areas or red flags that you would have to take a look at. The non-payment of taxes. So if there's FUTA and SUTA taxes that haven't been properly filed, who is responsible for that? And then failure to comply with the fair labor standards that Allison spoke about, that law that has been updated earlier this year. There's going to be additional audits and additional things that happen to take a look at and make sure that all of the checks and balances are completed properly. So having that area, that centralized process really focused on is important. And then the failure to comply with the Family Medical Leave Act. So there's sometimes issues where contractors have co-employment issues. There are individuals that are not employees, but they're treated like employees. And the first case of that co-employment issue, if you will, that came to light was in 2000. Microsoft, many years ago, 24 years ago, faced a $100 million lawsuit because they were misclassifying workers and not treating their contractors, or they were treating their contractors like their employees. So when that happened in the early 2000s, it really shed a light on the contract labor industry. And there were different processes and services that were provided over the last 20 years to help repair that. And with those, there are certain elements or certain areas that you can look at within your own organization to make sure that those compliance issues aren't met. So when you think of the risk avoidance and you think of how you're engaging with your 1099s, having a process in place to identify yourself as the employer is important. Having a third party or maybe a group of people that are in-house that are doing that for you is also something that you can take a look at. But having a dedicated team to make sure that those checks and balances are taken care of is very, very important. Having SLAs tied to it as well. So if you are engaging with 1099s and it is a business to business relationship, what types of SLAs are in place? Is there certain milestones or certain projects that have different tasks upon completion are being met, are being audited and being reviewed? That's important to ensure that the employee isn't acting as a W-2 employee, but as that resource that's providing that service to you. And then the IC compliance procedures, the vetting, the verifying, the monitoring of the IC consultants as they're on site and as they're working alongside your team on these projects, making sure that they have those regular check-ins. So when we look at some of the options around the third-party payrolling and independent contractor solutions, it's really one bucket of talent. And these employees or these individuals are non-employees. They are non-W-2 resources of your organization, and you are working alongside them to complete a project. We at Allére do have a service that offers up the management of those types of resources, making sure that the onboarding is proper, making sure that all of the checks and balances are done, even the invoicing is done on the back end. So having, sort of a barrier in there is something that we've seen support this model. And the subcontractor services is also something that we've seen really drive projects in the last couple years. So from a subcontracting perspective, many of our customers use different consultancy firms, but these 1099s are several layers down. And in order to have those types of relationships where the work is being conducted and you're getting the product that you are expected to be delivered, where is the checks and balance there? So having a third party involved to sort of support that model is really, really important. The regulatory environment is something that needs to be assessed. So all of the classifications that are happening in the U.S. have to will identify you as you as the employer, or you as the agency that is receiving that service, making sure that you're not liable for those issues of misclassification. So having a third party available for that support system can really help drive those results as well. Anyone that is ineligible to be a 1099, so when going through the different questions and going through the different layers of compliance to ensure that individual can serve at the client, we realize that some of them will not qualify as a 1099. So what do we do with those individuals? We do have an option to make them our W-2, so they become our payrolled employee and then can perform the service. If that's the case, those job descriptions are going to be really important. Maintaining those rates and ensuring the compliance with the rates are there is very important. And that payrolling aspect is something that we do with a lot of our customers today. So if they don't want to take on the legalities or the considerations of having that 1099 and doing those checks and balances, we can offer them a W-2 opportunity for that resource as well. So when we look at some of the issues that we've seen in the news, there was one that I wanted to discuss, and that was a larger organization where they had about 22,000 temps, 1099s that were misclassified. These individuals came in to the organization over 7 years. And during that time, there was a program in place to support the onboarding, but there wasn't those checks and balances that we discussed earlier. So with that, this employer is now facing $540 million in fines, a couple different class action lawsuits. And the way that this was uncovered was by going through a systematic approach of reviewing all of the workers that were currently on site. So if there are 1099s, if there were retirees that were coming back for knowledge transfer, if there were interns on site, a lot of those people weren't being tracked properly. And once the audit exposed this, there was some real issues that came to light. There are several other large companies that are having this play out in court. So we want to make sure that we give you the knowledge and the information that you need to make these decisions, how you're going to engage with this talent community. And if you decide to engage with them, what steps should you be taking? And we've outlined some of those steps for you. I believe it's on the next slide.
Okay. Let's see.
Yep. So as we go into looking at the contracted workforce, ensuring that those W-2 employees are being treated in a different manner than the 1099s or even the payrolled employees is something that is utmost of consideration from the co-employment perspective. So we really want to ensure that as you look at these talent communities, we have the different pockets of individuals and you're treating them and having different rules and processes tied to those individuals.
Mary, can you talk about some specific examples? I know you've shared a few, but just for the group that listening here, some success stories that you have, you can share.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we have worked with a couple different clients in the past, and one of the clients that we worked with had direct employees and indirect contract workers. So the indirect contract workers were working independently through a third party, but they represented an individual. So they were their own 1099 or LLC. So it was discovered that there was financial and legal risk, as well as working with those sub vendors. So the company that held the contracts with those indirect contract workers, they had specific industry, financial industry knowledge. So because of that, they weren't able to bring them on as direct employees. They wanted to make sure that they were getting that information for this project. And we realized that the sub vendor represented 1 to 3 indirect workers. So for the insurances and different federal, state, and human resource concerns that these individuals were so far down within the sub vendor relationship, what types of risks were associated due to that arrangement. So with those concerns, we went and initiated a preferred program that reduced the number of business vendors that they have, ensured compliance with legal, removing some of those vendors and some contract workers that weren't compliant, but really looking at the talent and saying what talent is critical, and if there is a risk to your organization to keep them, what are the non-compliance issues with that? What are the federal and state laws that may be of concern? So bringing back those recommendations, taking a look at the full talent population and saying these pockets are operating in this way, and we would encourage you to perhaps look at this or have this process updated or enforced, because really at the end of the day, having managers adopt the program is really the most important piece. So even with the example that I provided earlier for the $530 million lawsuit, those 22,000 workers were not properly vetted through the program that was enabled. So the enabled program came about a year and a half, 2 years prior, and the adoption wasn't happening. So really, if you look at it, it's a two-part method of understanding where the risks are, advising on what those recommendations are, and then implementing or adopting that solution. So, having that classification of all the sub vendors, the contract workers, record, agent of record, W-9s, whatever those 1099 populations are, making sure that there is a process in place to have that compliance measure met is really the first step in this process. So taking a full view of the landscape, understanding what's going on under the covers and where all of these workers are sitting and how they're engaging is really a good first step. But then also talking with HR, talent acquisition, and then even procurement or sourcing if the organization is large, to make sure that those contracts are in order, making sure that from the consultants all the way up through the business lines, that those processes are uniform and that there is that adoption there.
Okay, that's really, no, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. And I guess I have a question. I open this to Ro or Mary. We see startup organizations often beginning with independent contractors, just because they're in startup mode and they're figuring out what their organizational structures are going to be, and they need certain levels of expertise to help build and create what their future state is going to be. Is there a moment in time? I mean, the law doesn't specify number of people. Misclassification is misclassification. But is there a point in time when the types of audits that you're speaking about kind of come into play, or in your experience, what is that? What is that change, or what is that moment in time where you say we should pause and look and pay
Yeah, I
attention?
would say if you're utilizing more than a dozen or two 1099s, it's something that you should be looking at. If you engage with a 1099 or some sort of project-based work that is a one-off, I don't foresee that there's going to be any need for a real look under the covers or audit. But if you're using this to augment your staff, especially in startup mode, it is definitely an area that you're going to want to focus on as you're working on the big picture of building the business and getting this company off the ground. Utilizing that talent is going to be super simple. There's a lot of different avenues to go, with the different talent communities and different talent platforms. Also bringing people in, whether it's interns or retirees, like I mentioned, having that group of people is going to be important for a lot of startups. But I would say it's equally as important to shine a lens on that, because many startups don't invest in a really strong HR division or HR function. They might outsource that as well. So making sure that all areas of your talent strategy are being reviewed and understood and then adopted in-house is going to be really, really important, especially for these startups, because we do want you to focus on the big picture and go out and drive the business for the startup, but don't let those types of small details kind of trickle and fall away, because all of a sudden there could be something that happens. There could be an issue with a client, an issue with a project, and you're facing some sort of problem, and then this other larger problem shows its face, and it's that you misclassified workers. So I definitely think that it's a really important thing to do for startups, and it should be something that they're looking at if they use a good amount of 1099s, whether it's a dozen or more.
Okay, that's very helpful to have that kind of, like, it's everything, it's all important, but that number just kind of helps us think about,
Sure.
okay, maybe we pause and take a look.
Yeah.
Ro, I want to invite you to share a bit about your experience in working and supporting organizations that have this blended workforce, if you will, in terms of full-time employees, independent contractors, perhaps working on same projects, and what is that relationship, and how do you help them feel included, without exerting the control that may be put you at risk for the relationship of the independent contractor versus employee?
Happy to offer some insight. And you said my favorite word, which is make them feel included.
Mhm.
Um, when leading a contracted workforce or a blended workforce, it is very important that employers understand the motivations of the independent contractors. It has to be key. Typically, it's project-based. It is something specific that they're working on to contribute to the organization. And then there has to be a clear delineation of expectations. I can't stress this enough. There has to be literally in both directions. What are you expecting of this contractor, independent contractor? What are they contributing? What is their investment and or role where this project is concerned? And then what in turn are they looking from you in terms of resources, access? How is that all going to be established? Because you want to make sure it's clear and concise from the beginning of the working relationship. What happens is things get beyond scope. And typically that's what happened. Contractors begin to take on additional things And then it evolves into what looks like an employment relationship compared to what initiated as an independent contractor relationship. So you want to make sure that the expectations are clear, the scope of work is identified, and that the scope of work is maintained. So to do that, it is very important that there is an agreement on project goals and project timelines. This should not be an ongoing relationship. This should have a clear set amount of time, of course, with a little bit of wiggle room, because nothing always goes as planned. So we want to be able to pivot when necessary, but still within the constraints of something reasonable. And then agreeing on project goals. Now, the challenge that I've seen in my experience is the integration of independent contractors with employees and how to manage performance, because there's a different level of expectation that happens with managing employee performance by way of coaching and offering feedback, and if necessary, disciplinary performance improvement plans. Whereas contractors, performance is usually contingent upon how they're paid. You know, if you don't want to work with this independent contractor, guess what? You don't hire them back. There's a clear divide in how you manage performance and expectations. But the goal that I have found that works well is to make sure that they are established at the beginning of the relationship. It is very important. And then there's this level of understanding that although you're independent contractors are not your employees, there's still space to value what they bring to the project, what they add to the team, how they're augmenting your workforce. Not that it has to always be, you know, a pomp and circumstance, but there's a way to value contributions and to show the value that these individuals add to the workforce, even in support of your W-2 employees. So I am a big fan of frequency of checking in and making sure there's an established cadence to understand project updates, where there are obstacles, where there are barriers, how we are proceeding with deliverables. Because if you can establish a frequency, there's less surprise that will happen. Everyone is on the same page. We're always in constant communication. There is a touch point and a established frequency and or cadence for getting updates and making sure that independent contractors have the resources that they need and the access to certain information and or individuals that are going to make that project successful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very helpful, because I think there's, you mentioned access or information or resources. In order to do whatever the scope was that was outlined for people, they have to be able to be given or included in information that a team may have privy to, that perhaps as a contractor, I guess you just have to be intentional about including them on that team project. Mary, you mentioned that in some of the models that your group offers, that there is kind of some oversight because of the nature of the relationship to the project management, so to speak. I might not be saying it the way you said it so eloquently, but if you could elaborate a bit on what that looks like.
Yeah, so obviously they're somewhat of business to business relationships, but they're conducting work as an individual. So having a, consultant care type arrangement where our dedicated team is dealing with those individuals, ensuring that they understand what the expectations are, such as what Ro was kind of describing. Having those check-ins is really important, and it shouldn't just be at onboarding. And I think we were talking about this last week, where within the talent acquisition or HR sphere, onboarding is super important. It's making sure that welcome wagon comes and that there is expectation set. What's also happening on the back end? Are they able to maybe redeploy? Are they able to come back? Is it a different project that they could support or provide enhancement for because they worked on others? So it's really the entire life cycle of the individual, of the worker, and making sure that those connection points are being made. So of course the work is being conducted, and but there's also another element to the partnership that is happening between Allére and our client to make sure that it's a fully rounded process. It's a, the project is complete. There might be redeployments that are happening, but it really is that business to business exchange with the idea that this consultant or this individual is supporting that effort.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Um, Ro, do you want to take us through some tips? And Mary, I invite you to add in here anything that isn't listed that we can share with our audience today on what they should take away from this and think about for their own organizations.
Sure, sure. So some of the key takeaways that we want to leave you all with today. Number one, making sure that you evaluate your independent contractor agreements and to make sure your team is classified correctly. The big thing that we want to drive is making sure individuals are classified appropriately so that you mitigate the risk and possible financial impact that may have on your organizations. Taking time to understand how the law has changed as of March. I know we're probably not going to read the 330-page document. However, really taking time to evaluate those 6 characteristics, understanding the definitions as they are listed, and then figuring out kind of how your organizations can leverage different types of staffing models if necessary. And that is going to be a key factor because in doing this work, you may need to lean into the expertise of an Allére group, of an Exude, to that point to help you navigate this work. It's very important that you have that centralized, program to understand, to make sure that you are consistently adopting this throughout the organization. So one department is not doing one thing and another department is doing another thing, but there is a uniformed, centralized program that is understood and adopted by all leaders to make sure that this is impacting the organization in a positive way and not causing excessive risk. And then just understanding that the world in which we work is evolving. As the stats stated at the beginning of the presentation, there is going to be an ever-changing way in how we work, and making sure that we stay on the pulse of what that means from a litigation standpoint, what that means from a people management standpoint, and being prepared to navigate that so that organizations and companies can be as agile as they need to grow and thrive and achieve the success that they've set out to achieve. And I'll pause for my fellow panelists to offer their insights as well.
Ro, thank you for that. And you just made me think this world of work is evolving. As we speak, there are lawsuits that are being initiated in regards to this change in the ruling. And so this may evolve over time, one lawsuit at a time. We have an election coming up. We don't know what the outcome of the election is going to be. That could impact these regulations. There are some Supreme Court cases that will be under consideration or under review in this next cycle, which also may impact the outcome of these regulations. So what we tell you today may be different tomorrow, and keeping abreast of all of this is going to be really important. Mary, anything that you wanted to add to this list of takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you mentioned the evolution of work, and we have all sort of been witness to that, joining the staffing or contingent labor industry nearly 20 years ago. Many of the things that we're talking about were at once sort of bleeding edge. And I do believe that right now we are at sort of a pivotal moment in time. The pandemic obviously, moved that fairly quickly. move this issue fairly quickly, but there is something that's happening, and it's with, the boomers are attriting out, they're maybe wanting to come back for knowledge transfer, people want more flexibility. The way of work is really changing and evolving. And since 2020, the use of 1099s or independent contractors has increased. I want to say it was 139% is what the Department of Labor, showcased. So this is going to be a continual topic. It's going to evolve, like Allison said, but being ahead of it and having a lens on it, making sure that it's not getting swept to the side. It is just as important as all of the talent strategies that are happening within your organization. So just as you're looking at your W-2 hiring, and with situations around agile growth, this is a great option. And so it's not to scare you, and it's not to make you nervous, but it's definitely to add some caution, because there are changes happening and we are aware of those changes, and we want to support and be that guiding light to on this journey as you look at your talent communities. So just to reiterate that it is changing, it's going to continue to change, and within the next 5 years, this topic is going to be a lot more robust, and there'll probably be a lot more law changes in advance of this as well. So just really wanted to share that, and excited for what the future brings as it relates to the world of work, because it is an exciting time, and individuals are getting the option to go ahead and engage with companies in the way that they see fits their lifestyle. And to Rose's point, that is really special from an inclusivity perspective.
Great. Thank you. I just want to make one point here too. We're talking about the new independent contractor rule, but there are other state regulations that that could be its own series of webinars to talk about. So just know that you may meet, or you may do the evaluation of the independent contractor criteria, but you also may be bound, depending on the state that you're in, to abide by the state, they call them ABC rules, things like that. So just make sure as you go down this path that you consult with human resources or the Allére group or your attorneys to ensure that you're considering all the laws that may impact how you classify people. There is in the chat, there was a comment or a question for Ro around if the scope of work of an independent contractor changes, should you update the SOW to reflect the new terms of the project?
I would say yes. If there's any change to the scope of work, you definitely want to make sure there is an update or an amended project agreement, scope of work, time frame, and also outlining expectations, most definitely.
Okay, great. And there's a question around if human resources a core function? Is human resource a core function of a business? How does that look at HR consulting? So when you look at the law, and they look at this on a case-by-case basis, but it's generally around what the business does. So if the business, like I gave that example about the tomato farm. So if the business sells tomatoes, then they're going to look at that. We do see a lot of outsourcing and contractors in support services to businesses, right? So it's not the actual work that they do. It's not their product or service, but they're actually supporting businesses to be able to do that. So that's where we see accounting and finance and technology and graphic design and freelance journalists, right? So newspapers, businesses to sell news or to write stories, and there's quite a bit of contracting that goes on in that business as well.
And also in the vein of marketing, communications, social media, a lot of
Right.
that freelance contract work for supporting organizations.
Yeah, and it's bringing in that expertise for that period of time to do that specific scope of work or provide that service. So that said, that brings us to the end of our conversation, and I just want to thank so much our friends at Allére, Mary, for your time and your team's support in getting you here. And for Ro, always a pleasure talking with you. And for all of you who took time out of your day to listen in on our webinar, we hope, again, we'll send a recording of this out to you, and we're all available for any additional questions that we may not have been able to answer. But we hope you have a great rest of your week, and thank you again for joining us.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day.